Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Nature Live Online. I'm Alison. I'm your host for today. Now, if you've been following our previous talks, welcome back. It's fantastic to have you. But if you're new to Nature Live, we're an event that used to happen at the Natural History Museum in London in our Attenborough studio, where we'd give you a chance to actually meet and speak with some of our scientists who work behind the scenes at the museum. So you can find out a bit more about them, the collections that they look after, and some of the brilliant work that goes on behind the scenes. Now, our doors have been closed, although not for much longer. So we decided to bring our talks online direct to you at home. Now, today we're going to be focusing on whales and some of the fantastic things we can learn about whales and dolphins from our museum collections. Now, to guide us through today, I'm going to be joined by one of our curators, Richard Sabin. Now, I've got quite a few questions for Richard, but I hope that you will have too. So please don't be shy. If you have any questions at all during our talk, post them in the comments and we'll try and get through as many of your questions as we can. But let's meet our speaker today. Richard, are you there?
Hi, I am indeed.
Hey, Richard, it's good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Now, let's find out, first of all, what you do at the museum.
Yeah, it's always a difficult question to answer. I'm a principal curator working in the mammal group in the Department of Life Sciences, and I've been fortunate enough for the past 28 years or so to be able to work with these wonderful reference collections that we have, these research collections which allow us to find out so much about the natural world. And these are literally hundreds of thousands of specimens of animals which have been collected over the past 250 years, and they're used by scientists at the Natural History Museum as well as scientists from around the world. And my job is to develop those collections and to basically make sure that they're accessible and the information that we generate about them are accessible to.
And it's not just the collections, is it? You also do a lot with our exhibitions.
Yeah, I've been really lucky. Back in 2017, I was able to work on the redisplay of our beautiful blue whale, Hope, in Hinsey Hall, and also the whales beneath the surface exhibition, which allowed us to look into the science of whales in a bit more detail. So it's a great thing to do.
A brilliant exhibition, and of course Hope, our gorgeous blue whale skeleton. It's fantastic to see her hanging from Hinsey Hall, and soon we'll be able to go back and see her in person, hopefully. Now, I know this is a specimen that's close to your heart, and we are going to talk a little bit about Hope a bit later on, but I wanted to find out a little bit more about our cetacean, our whale and dolphin collections. What sorts of things do we hold at the museum?
It's probably going to be a surprise to people that we do hold such a large collection. It's one of the leading collections of its kind in the world, but the skeleton collection on its own is around about 2,500 specimens, skeletons of whales, dolphins and porpoises that we collectively call the cetacea, from around the world, covering more than 500 years of time, believe it or not. As well as the skeletons that we hold, we've got other materials. So we've got examples of, you can see on the slide now, in the wet collections that some people might have visited at the Darwin Centre at South Kensington. We have examples of internal organs, tissue samples, fetuses. There are also things like pieces of baleen. So these are the plates that grow down from the inside of the roof of the mouth of the big whales, like the blue whales and the fin whales, that we'll be focusing on just a little bit later. We have quite a large collection of teeth as well, which can tell us an awful lot about an animal's life, which we'll discuss later on. But it's a really diverse collection, huge collection, and it's basically a global resource, a global scientific resource.
It's an amazing collection, and we also have a strandings program as well, don't we?
Yeah. Back in 1913, we approached the government of the time and asked for access to the bodies of whales and dolphins that were washing up around the British Isles to see if we could make sense of what was going on. And actually, that program still goes on. We partner with the Zoological Society of London, who carry out the post-mortem work, and all of those data about strandings around the UK still get written up as a report and go to government every single year. So really valuable work.
Incredible, and quite historic, and I believe it's online as well, isn't it now?
Absolutely. So you can see an example of some of the early record cards. In fact, the first record cards that were produced back in 1913 Now, of course, the records that are compiled go straight into a database, and those data are accessible to anybody who needs them.
Absolutely brilliant. And of course, there is a huge amount of information contained within our collections, and some of it quite surprising. Some of our specimens themselves are a little bit surprising. We do, for example, hold some specimens of whale earwax, which can tell us an awful lot. So it might be quite surprising to some people that whales actually have earwax. So what is it? How does it form?
Well, I've been immersing myself in whale earwax now for about 4 years, and I can tell you it's just an absolute delight. But it's surprising. Whales, like humans, we're talking baleen whales here, the filter feeding whales. They have ear canals just like we do, but they don't have an external opening to those ear canals. So they actually secrete cerumen. This is a waxy substance into the ear canal, as well as shedding tissue, and that leads to the buildup of these plugs, these huge plugs. And in blue whales, they can be up to 0.5 meter long. But the thing is, these plugs are really important to us because that cerumen, that waxy material, it helps to lubricate the ear canal. It can help protect against bacteria. It's a really useful material because it's full of fatty deposits. It's also full of protein, keratin, which is, of course, it's a naturally occurring mammalian substance. But it gets laid down. These plugs are formed in bands, and a little bit like tree rings. Those of you who've seen a section through a tree trunk, and you can count the layers of material, the growth layers of material within those tree rings. It's pretty much the same situation with these earplugs. And we discovered back in the 1950s, actually, at the Natural History Museum, that these earplugs could be used to help us tell how old an animal was, a large whale was, when it died, by counting those bands of material. So really important stuff, but actually they've really come into their own in the past few years with the new science that we've generated from them.
Right. What sorts of information do they contain? What can we find out from them?
Well, it's surprising. I was at a conference back in 2015 in San Francisco with marine biologists, biogeochemists, other museum curators, and we were listening to people talking about post-mortems that they carried out on blue whales and grey whales around the Arctic coasts, and they were looking at particularly the earplugs that they'd managed to take from the ear canals. They knew that this material, because it's so fatty, it's a really good way to look at the kinds of chemicals that are produced inside the body, the hormones, and also the chemicals outside the body, the pollutants in the environment. They're all actually held and locked in to these plugs. So if you can take out these plugs and if you can section them and look at the individual layers, you know when your animal died, you can count those layers of tissue and go back in time and look at levels of things like cortisol. Cortisol was the thing that we were focusing on. It's a stress hormone. It's a mammalian response to stress, and the level of cortisol, the stress hormone that you find within these individual bands, basically depends upon the severity, how severe the exposure to a particular event was by that animal. So it's an incredibly useful record, effectively. We were super surprised at what we were able to find.
It's amazing, that image there. You can literally see those little bands, those rings that are laid down over the years.
Yeah, you're looking at one plug there from an animal that lived for more than 35 years. And actually the plugs that we were using for the study, the plugs at the Natural History Museum, we discovered that the oldest plug in the sample that we used at the Natural History Museum, from the Smithsonian in the USA, or from the other laboratories that were able to access more modern material, our sample from 1910 at the Natural History Museum was from an animal that had been born in 1870. So suddenly we were able to create what we call a baseline, a time series of samples from 1870 to 2016. It's 146 years, covering the increase in commercial whaling, covering wars, covering pollution events, covering all kinds of things. And what we wanted to see was if there was actually a correlation between the amount of cortisol in those individual layers of tissue versus what was going on in the oceans at the time.
And we saw in that image lots of sort of peaks and troughs. So how do we interpret those? Are we seeing more stress at certain times? And what could we attribute that to?
Absolutely. So let me just start by holding up this carrot, because it's a very important carrot. The samples that we were using at the Natural History Museum the plugs were approximately the size of this carrot, but not as tasty, I can tell you. In blue whales, these plugs can be up to 0.5 metre long, but in most of the samples that we were using, they're around about 10 to 20 centimetres. Those peaks and troughs that you saw in the slide actually represent the amount of cortisol above what we call the baseline, the expected amount that you would see in tissues from an animal that was living a relatively normal life. So the peaks would relate to an increase in stress from a particular event. What we found that was probably not surprising, looking back now, it's not surprising, but at the time it was, commercial whaling, the large-scale slaughter of whales in the oceans, really gained momentum by the end of the 19th century. And in the early 20th century, the first 15, 20 years of the 20th century, hundreds of thousands of blue whales and fin whales were slaughtered in the Southern Ocean. And you can see how effective the machinery was that was being used at the time. In the early 20th century, they developed faster whaling ships. They developed cannon-powered harpoons, which could fire further into bigger animals. So the animals that could formerly outrun the whaling ships suddenly weren't able to. Now, these lead to direct stresses on the animals themselves, of course, the death of the animal. But think about the other things too, the peripheral things, the things that were going on around those whaling activities. We call those sublethal stressors, things that weren't going to kill the animal outright, but things that are going to affect its behavior and its health significantly by causing those levels of stress. And think about one of the things that you're trying to do at certain times of the year. You're trying to find a mate. And if your population has crashed because of overwhaling, you're not going to be able to find a mate. So that causes stress. We see these levels of stress increasing through the 20th century as commercial whaling really does start to have an effect on populations. But we see an interesting anomaly, if you like, around about 1939, the start of the Second World War, 39 to 45. Of course, commercial whaling activities ceased because of the war that was going on in Europe at the time. And what we would expect to see is a decrease perhaps in the amount of stress hormone in these plugs. Not at all. We see an increase of 10% above that baseline expected level. And we think that's probably because of the exposure by these animals to the war in the ocean, the submarines firing torpedoes, detonating explosives under the ocean, the war in the air, ships firing at each other. Cetaceans, these are whales, dolphins, and porpoises, are incredibly sensitive to sound. And it's one of the things that we know affects them, what we call anthropogenic noise. So after the Second World War, and with the resumption of commercial whaling in the 1950s, you start to see an increase again in the levels of stress, the corresponding levels of stress to a certain degree, looking at these overlapping earplugs that we got from different animals over this 146-year period. Now, the really interesting thing is that in the 1960s, when the first moves were made to protect these large whales, particularly blue whales, in 1966, a ban on the commercial exploitation of blue whales. By the 1980s, there was a complete moratorium, a complete ban on commercial whaling. We see a decrease, but actually from the 1990s and through to the present day, there's a gradual increase again. And we think this is down to the real time impact of these, again, sublethal stressors, more shipping, more pollution in the oceans, more anthropogenic noise from a whole range of different activities, making it hard for the animals to hear and navigate in a whole range of different things. And so, unfortunately, we're actually seeing an increase, what we think is an increase in the levels of stress hormones in these animal tissues that are almost comparable to the peak of the commercial whaling trade. Now, that's anthropogenic, not whaling. That's anthropogenic causes other than whaling. It's something that we have a responsibility to act upon.
Wow, it's incredible.
It's all about evidence. It's all about evidence-based science. It's about presenting your evidence to governments, to conservation bodies, and this is what we do. And to create a time series from the present day back to 1870, I think is quite a remarkable thing, and from museum collections primarily.
Could only be done using museum collections, which is absolutely key. And it's not just stressors like whaling and world wars. Pollution has been a bit of a problem, hasn't it? And do we see signs of that in whale earwax?
We do.
Chemicals and things.
We do indeed. I keep using this phrase anthropogenic, and what I mean by anthropogenic is caused by humans. That actually means caused by humans. So all of the things that we're doing in the environment that causes these stresses to animals living on land and in the oceans. Now, we did a second study. The first study on the earplugs, so the stress levels in the earplugs was published back in 2018, and in May this year, actually during lockdown, we were able to publish another paper which was looking at the levels of these persistent pollutants that exist in the oceans. Now, think of all the things that used to be used, pesticides and chemicals used by heavy industry through the 20th century. This second study looks at the past 80 years, because from the 1970s and 80s, there started to be bans put in place because we knew that these chemicals were so toxic. So they were banned on land. But what do we see? Decades later, we still see them in the oceans. We still see them cycling through what we call the marine ecosystem. And whales, dolphins, and porpoises sit right at the top of the food chain, and they're feeding on everything else right the way down the food chain. So they're going to be taking in these pollutants, which are still in the environment. And it's surprising, probably not surprising, to see that it's taking so much time for these banned chemicals, which have been banned for use by humans on land, are still in the oceans. And again, we understand from this that it's going to have an effect on the things like the reproductive abilities of certain whales and dolphins, depending on where they migrate to and what their feeding behavior is like. But the problem is those pollutants, those anthropogenic, those human-made pollutants get laid down in the fatty tissues of the body, in the blubber. And when the mothers are actually nursing their offspring, their calves, they're producing milk, just like mammals on land, they're producing milk. Those pollutants are actually passed through the milk into the offspring, so they build up and cause problems as the animal's life goes on.
Richard, we have some quite interesting questions coming from our audience on the earwax and the studies you've been doing. Sally has asked, will there be a trough in stress levels for 2020 owing to the absence of much shipping and shipping noise due to COVID-19 and the lockdown?
Do you know, that's a brilliant question, actually, from Sally. It's an excellent question, because there's a study which has been started during the lockdown called the study of the effects of what they're calling the anthropause. And this is, we've all been in our houses. I'm still in mine. We've all been in our houses doing our thing, being locked down, shipping, air travel, a whole range of things. Those activities have become very low level. So would we expect to see a drop in stress levels? Who knows? It's a good question. It may well be that is the case, but there are a lot of variables, a lot of things that influence the way that these animals become stressed. But I would expect to see some results that indicate there is an effect of this low level of human activity. But I think we've probably got a few years to wait until that actually comes through.
Yeah, definitely. Time will tell on that one. Jessica and also Eva online were asking, how much earwax can you get from one whale's ear?
Yeah, I go back to my informative carrot again. I knew that there was no possible way to quantify, what these plugs look like unless I could find a carrot, and I found one. So I would say from a blue whale, probably, if you imagine 3 of these, there's my finger, there's the carrot. Imagine three of these in terms of length, and probably, double the thickness of this. It's a lot of material. It's actually very difficult to remove the plugs from the ear canal once the animals obviously have died at post-mortem, because you have to get under the lower jaw and then into the ear canal and then safely remove the entire plug. So it's a very difficult process. But yeah, about 3 carrots worth for a blue whale, I would say.
That's plenty. That's definitely plenty to work with.
Yeah.
And then we had another question from Michael online. He had heard that whale earwax was used in making candles on old whaling ships. Is that true, or is that a myth? Do we know?
I've never heard about that one, but if somebody's got evidence to suggest that was the case, I'd love to know more about it. Yeah, I can't comment on that, I'm afraid.
And another question from Richard before we move on, asking, do whales become hard of hearing as the wax in their ear builds up?
So a lot of similarities between humans and whales, but actually that's where the similarity ends, because the way that baleen whales actually hear underwater, the way that they communicate, the way that they receive sound is entirely different to how we receive sound as mammals living on land. So effectively, baleen whales use the bones of the skull to receive the sound that comes back from their mates or from, you know, the kind of the way that they're reading their environment. They don't need their ears to actually hear that sound. And in fact, if you think about the way that they feed, they go down into a dive of, say, 200 meters. It's an awful lot of pressure that's put on the tiny bones inside the ear structure. So those plugs that build up inside the ear canal actually help to exclude the air from the ear canal and protect those bones from the pressure as they dive. So if anything, these earplugs, it's kind of a secondary effect, but they are actually quite beneficial. So no, it doesn't affect their hearing at all.
It's a great question, though. Now, Richard, moving on from earwax, whales' teeth can be quite telling as well, can't they? Just remind us which whales have teeth and which don't.
Okay, so we're talking about the cetacea, again, a group of about 90 or so species that we know worldwide. They fall into two groups. The group I've just been talking about, the baleen whales, the filter feeders that have those individual plates of baleen that we'll talk about just now. And then you have what we call the toothed whales, the odontocetes. These are things like sperm whales, a huge sperm whale which feeds on giant squid, and then the killer whales, which of course is the largest member of the dolphin family, and then all of the dolphins and porpoises, freshwater dolphins too. These are the two groups, and in fact, the baleen whales, the filter feeding whales, didn't really appear in the fossil record. You don't see them until about 25 million years ago, but actually the common ancestor of all whales and dolphins first emerged about 50 million years ago. So a comparatively recent emergence, if you like. So the toothed whales are, again, we're fortunate because those individual teeth from dolphins, porpoises, sperm whales, they contain layers of information like the earplugs. And on the slide now, we have an example on the right is a section of a sperm whale tooth. Now that tooth is around about 15 centimeters long, and it's been sectioned from the tip to the root, and you're looking inside the tooth. That V-shaped gap that you can see at the bottom of the tooth is where the nerve would be. That's the pulp cavity. And new material is being formed there constantly. And so the teeth build up like the earplugs in layers, and like the earplugs, we can use them to look at things that have happened in the animal's life at different points in time. We can take samples for DNA. We can look at things like stable isotopes, which I'll talk about again in a second, but they're hugely informative. Just one tooth for an animal can give us tons of information about its life.
So we've got, I think it's a killer whale here, haven't we? So killer whales, particularly, their teeth are interesting, aren't they? Tell us about that.
You know, in a nutshell, I mean, killer whales are just hugely important for so many different reasons. We've learned an enormous amount in the past 20 years about killer whales, particularly. Back in the 19th century, my predecessors at the Natural History Museum were collecting killer whale skulls from around the British Isles. And worldwide now, we recognize one species of killer whale, Orcinus orca, one species. Back in the 19th century, they were describing 1, 2, 3 different species or more of killer whales. And part of this was based on the fact that they were observing different sizes in the skulls consistently, and also different types of wear on the teeth. Now, this was actually quite, in a way, fortuitous and also forward thinking. It was almost like a prediction, because what they were seeing was what we now know to be different ecotypes of killer whales. And an ecotype is effectively a population from a species that moves into an environment by choice, to a certain extent by choice, and then isolates itself within that environment by the way it feeds, by the way it communicates, the size of its body, the pattern that you see on the surface of the skin. All these things start to differ from the next ecotype. And so far, scientists have identified 10 different ecotypes of killer whales across the world's oceans. And it could well be that we need to look, and will look, at whether or not these are different subspecies or possibly emerging species. But what we do know is that those patterns of tooth wear that the scientists here back in the 19th century were observing are actually based on the way that these different ecotypes of killer whales feed. So we know that around the British Isles and the northern coast of Europe and Scandinavia, there are 2 types of killer whales in the North Atlantic. the Northeast Atlantic Type 1 killer whale, which feeds almost exclusively on fish, and then the Northeast Atlantic killer whale Type 2, which feeds on other whales, believe it or not, porpoises, seals, sharks occasionally. We've been able to look at DNA. We've been able to look at these things, again, called stable isotopes, which are elements of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, which exist in different levels in different parts of the ocean. It's really quite useful for us, because as we eat and drink, we lay down these elements in our bodies, and then scientists can come along and read the levels that you have in your tissues. Now, with these killer whales, these two sorts that you find around the British Isles, you can see differences in the tooth wear. You can see differences from their stable isotopes in the way that they're feeding, but you can also see a genetic, what we call a divergence. So they're doing this, they're moving away from each other. They are becoming species effectively. And it's a really remarkable thing that we're seeing. There's also a high degree of what we call cultural transmission. So imagine that as we learn, we're sitting in school as children and we're watching the teacher and we're listening to the teacher, to what they're saying, and we're absorbing the information. Exactly the same with the killer whales. They watch the way that their mothers and their grandmothers particularly are feeding, and they teach the offspring, and it's cultural transmission. There's such a high degree of cultural transmission within killer whales and such a high degree of diversity. It's really comparable to the way that humans have moved across the earth. It's just incredible.
It's fantastic, and all those pieces of scientific puzzle coming together, and the fact that we can see these species moving apart, that's absolutely amazing. We've had a couple of more questions from our viewers. A question from Margie, just on the killer whale skull that we showed just a little bit earlier. She said there were tiny holes in the bone at the base of each tooth. What are those holes? Perhaps we can get the image up again of the killer whale skull with the teeth.
I think I might know what that is before the image comes. Potentially, it may well be that what you're looking at there is holes that were made by the preparators, the people working in the museum, to keep the tooth in position. Because obviously, when a killer whale dies and all of the flesh rots away, the teeth will drop out. So in order for those teeth to be able to be kept in place, for the specimens to be handled or to go on display, they make a tiny hole in the base of the jaw and put a pin through the tooth to hold it in position.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And a question from Karen, just going back to the stressors and cetaceans. With the Earth's magnetic fields changing, are we noticing any stress issues in cetaceans from that issue potentially?
Well, that's a good question, and it's not possible to answer that completely at this stage, because we need to fully quantify what those changes in the Earth's magnetic fields are, how extensive they've been, what time periods they cover. But you're right in asking that question, because obviously there are dozens, if not hundreds or more, thousands of species which use the Earth's magnetic fields to navigate, to find their way around. And cetaceans, humpback whales, they've got the longest, or one of the longest migration routes of any animal. So they need to be able to know where they are at any point in time. We do know that there can be problems which are caused by things like solar flares. There have been some discussion about whether or not solar flares can actually lead to mass strandings of things like beaked whales, which are known to really heavily rely upon the Earth's magnetic fields. There's still a lot of work to do there, so I couldn't say 100% that we would notice more stress as a result of that, but it's something that we need to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. And I just want to squeeze in one more question going back to our earwax. It's a great question from one of our viewers asking, does a whale's earwax have any unique odour?
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah, it does. It's not quite as bad as the odour that you get from, I'm told, your own earwax at points in time. I mean, come on, we've all done it. But it's not like anything that you'd recognise necessarily, and it's very hard for me to describe, and it's nothing like a carrot. That's all I can say.
Fair enough. Now, Richard, we must talk about hope probably our most famous specimen, our blue whale that hangs in Hinsey Hall, because you were heavily involved in getting Hope in her position, and also in studying not just her skeleton but her baleen as well. We've learned quite a lot about her life just from studying her skeleton, her baleen, haven't we?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that we had as much information, that we could extract as much information from Hope as possible. Because if you think about it, Hope died in 1891. She came to the museum in 1892 as a specimen, and was basically in the scientific collections at the museum until the early 1930s, when she was put on display in our mammals hall above the blue whale model that we've got. But she was unavailable for research because she was suspended so high up in the roof space. You could look at her, but you couldn't actually do any research. And actually, she's the most complete blue whale specimen that we have in our research collection. So when she was taken down, when we decided to bring her into Hinsey Hall and replace Dippy with Hope, I really wanted to make sure that we could digitize every single bone. So use a 3D scanner to produce a model of every single bone, and then produce basically a complete 3D model of the skeleton, which we've got, and you can search for that on the museum's website. You can play with Hope's skeleton, you can zoom in on the bones. But more than that, I wanted to see if there was anything more that we could add to our knowledge of Hope's life, because I'd estimated that from looking at her skeleton, from the development of the bones, that she was probably between 5 and maybe 10 to 12 years of age. So still quite a young animal when she stranded, when she died. Did we know any more about her? Do we know any more about her? Well, the investigation of her body back in 1891, where she beached on the sandbanks at Wexford in southeast Ireland, on the southeast coast of Ireland, a beautiful place. It didn't show us anything, didn't tell us anything about what might have caused her death or what kind of life she'd had. But as well as getting hold of the skeleton in 1892, we got hold of 400 individual plates of what you can see now, what we call baleen. And this is a material that grows from the inside, the roof of the mouth. It grows down in place of teeth, no teeth. These things grow down, and they're lined up like a comb on either side of the upper jaw. It's keratin. It's material made from keratin. Keratin is what your hair and what your fingernails are made from. It's exactly the same. There's no difference whatsoever. It's a type of protein. It grows constantly, like your fingernails and your hair, and it's being worn down constantly in the mouths of these whales, because their tongue moves backwards and forwards inside the mouth over the surface of the baleen, and it causes them to fray. And actually the bristles that you can see in the photograph there, that's as a result of the plates of baleen fraying. What we were able to do was exactly the same as what we did with the earplugs. We could see that these plates of baleen were growing in layers, in bands, and we were able to determine how fast these plates of baleen grow. And so by measuring a single plate of baleen, we could estimate how many years of the animal's life it represented. We took samples from individual plates that represented about 7 years of life for Hope. And what we discovered was that we could use stable isotopes, and these are the elements that I mentioned before: oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, that are found in different levels in different parts of the ocean. Where she'd moved to, we wanted to try and see if we could actually create a track for her moving from the northern coasts of Britain, Iceland, Greenland, right up in the Arctic to feed down to the west coast of Africa and the Azores, that region, the warmer waters, to breed, to find a mate to give birth. And a colleague of mine, Natalie Cooper, who did a talk on this subject actually a few weeks ago, a fantastic talk, led the analysis with a colleague of ours working down at the National Oceanographic Centre in Southampton. And surprise, surprise, we got this brilliant information that seemed to suggest her movements were pretty much what we'd expect for a North Atlantic blue whale, from the Arctic region down to the west coast of Africa, seasonally feeding, breeding, and so on. With Hope, what we saw was in the last year or so of her life, she moved down into warmer waters, but she stayed in warmer waters off the west coast of Africa for almost a year. Now, we assume from that quite happily assume from that modelling of all the data, that what she was doing was she was looking after a calf. She'd given birth, and she was looking after a calf. When a female blue whale gives birth, it takes about anywhere between 10 and 12 months for the animal to develop inside the womb of the mother. When it's born, it's with its mother constantly for about 10 months or so, up to a year, and then it goes off and does its own thing. All that time, the mother is producing this really high energy milk to help the animal grow. And of course, the animal's doing fine, the calf is doing fine, but the mother, she gets weaker, and it has a real effect on how strong she is. So Hope, we think, may have been looking after a calf. She weaned it, which meant that she let it go off on its own, and she started to head back north again. And it was as she was travelling back north that she got caught in the shallow waters around Southeast Ireland and beached. It's great to have that information. It adds some more knowledge about the life of this incredible specimen to what we already know. But I wanted to see if we could go a step further, and we did. I was able, fortunately, to work again with the team at Baylor University in Texas, who did the work with the earplugs, to see whether or not we could get not stable isotope data from the place of baleen, but hormone data, like we did from the earplugs. We don't have any of Hope's earplugs, but we have the baleen. We took samples, and we found something surprising. And I actually haven't released this information to anyone yet. This is the first time we've gone public with this. But the results came through just before lockdown started, that we found the presence of another type of hormone. So cortisol is the stress hormone. We found progesterone, which is the pregnancy hormone. You find it in females who are pregnant or have been pregnant. It's present in the tissues. And we found it in Hope's baleen, in the top part of the baleen, the more recently produced material that supported the other study from the stable isotopes, that Hope had been pregnant, because we found progesterone in the tissues that were growing within that plate of baleen present for about 10.4 months, which is around about the gestation period of a blue whale calf. It's just incredible, absolutely incredible. We think we've got conclusive proof now that in the final year or so of her life, she had been pregnant. She did go full term. She gave birth, and she looked after the calf. She weaned it, and then she died, unfortunately. But it means that hopefully her offspring are still out there in the oceans, carrying her genes into the future.
That is incredible, and an exclusive to Nature Live. We're breaking the news. That's amazing. Thank you, Richard. It's wonderful to have that story confirmed, and yeah, it didn't a sad ending for Hope, but nice to know that perhaps her relatives are still out there.
Well, if you think about the length of time that a blue whale lives, anywhere up to about 80 years, it's very similar to the lifespan of a human, actually. If she'd given birth in about 1890, that means that her son or daughter may have lived to around about 1970, and that Hope's grandchildren swimming in the waters that we see more frequently now, blue whales in the Irish Sea or off the south coast of Britain. So fingers crossed.
Oh, that's a lovely thought. Now we've had a couple more questions I just want to get to before we wrap up. So great question from Sally, actually, asking, have we any whale fossils that display something intermediate between toothed and baleen whales?
We don't in our collection, but there are fabulous collections in Japan, in Australia, and in the USA, where those intermediate, what we think are intermediate forms, do seem to exist. There was a paper published not so long ago, which seems to suggest that there is an early form of whale that had neither teeth nor baleen, but was just using an incredibly muscular tongue in combination with suction feeding to take its prey. But it does look as though there were intermediate forms, and actually, if you do a search online for the papers that relate to those specimens, you'll find them. They're really quite fascinating.
And we did have a question earlier from Ollie, just on the earwax again, asking, how do we actually extract the earwax from the whale? Is that easy to do?
It's not easy to do. It's once you know what you're looking for, you have to remove the lower jaw, and that's no easy thing to do, because each of the lower jaw bones of a large whale, like a fin whale or a blue whale, can weigh around about 1/4 of a ton. So you need to be able to, obviously during post-mortem, you need to be able to break into the tissue at the back of the lower jaw, remove that from where it pivots with the upper jaw, and then you find these big bulbous bones. These are the tympanic bones, the largest bone of the ear mechanism. If you find that bone, follow it round, and then you can find the base of the ear canal. You then use a very, very sharp knife to open up the ear canal and prise it open, and inside, if you're lucky, you'll find a complete earplug, and then you have to remove it very carefully because they are quite soft. Like a carrot that's been left in the fridge for about 2 or 3 weeks, there's a bit bendy, that kind of softness.
Wow, no mean thick feet, but worth doing, just for the incredible information that we can.
Absolutely is, yeah, really key information. We had no idea back in the early 20th century that the material that we were collecting at the time would have such value for science, but that's the case for all museum collections, I think.
Absolutely, and we find new ways to study old materials, don't we?
Exactly. Every few years there's a new development, and for me, I started at the museum in 1992. Some of the things we're doing now, it's like science fiction. If you told me what we'd be doing now back in 1992, probably wouldn't believe you.
Now, we've had one question that came in earlier, actually, right at the beginning of our talk, quite an important question from YouTube, asking, how are whales being affected by climate change? Will they adapt to it? And if they did go extinct, how would that affect the ecosystem? Very, very big questions.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and actually it's the question that's being addressed by all of this work that's going on. I mean, what we're doing at the Natural History Museum with these earplugs might seem quite novel and unusual, but actually the data that are being generated, I mentioned before, it's about evidence-based science. It's about producing evidence which can then be taken by your colleagues and built upon to build even stronger cases to show that there are changes taking place caused potentially by us. So the issues that we have with climate change and the rate at which the climate appears to have been changing over time, recent time, is that animals like whales and dolphins have taken millions of years to adapt, to evolve and adapt to the environments that they live in, to feed in the particular way that they feed. And it can cause rapid changes that these animals are not adapted to meet effectively. They can't adapt quickly enough. So I think that the short answer is yes. The effects of climate change, acidification of oceans, sea surface temperature rises, all of those things shifting prey species. So as water warms up, you get movements in the whole of the food chain within the ocean. All of these things in combination are going to have an effect. So yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be monitored. And the thing is, whales, dolphins, porpoises, seals, sea lions, all of these marine mammals are used as indicators of how much disturbance we as a species, the human species, are causing to the marine environment.
Absolutely. Are we seeing changes already? Are we seeing changes in movements, for example?
We've started to pick up things like changes in distribution of the smaller species of cetaceans, the dolphins that we see around Britain. So the dolphins that we used to see around the southern coast of Britain in the warmer waters have actually been moving, it would appear, from the distribution data that we've collected through the strandings program over the past 100 years. You can see those warmer water species moving further north up the coast of Britain, off to the north coast of Scotland. Also, some of the things that they predate upon, some of the fish, we're seeing warmer water fish species moving in. So consequently, if you have those things moving, you'll have the predators of those fish also moving to follow them. So yeah, there are signs that is the case.
I just have a couple more questions before we wrap up, because we are almost sadly out of time. But Richard, I did want to ask you, our blue whale Hope, why did we call her Hope?
It's a really simple answer, and it's one that just, it almost answers itself. Hope. When we were asked back in 2013 to come up with an idea for a specimen that would replace Dippy. Dippy, of course, our wonderful dinosaur cast that became so iconic and still is out there traveling around the UK. We wanted to make sure that we were making the change for the right reason, and we wanted to show the world that the Natural History Museum it's a modern, contemporary, relevant research and education institution that is involved with trying to answer some of these big questions which are facing the planet today. You know, we've just been talking about a couple of them. We've got research teams at the museum involved in all kinds of scientific research to try and address these issues around climate change and extinction and a whole range of other things. But we wanted to showcase hope in Hinsey Hall. I was fortunate enough to spend 3 years researching her new dive pose. That diving lunge feeding position that she's in was based on field work that I was lucky enough to do with teams out off the California coast watching blue whales feeding. I wanted to show how much we were learning through scientific observation, through the use of cameras and accelerometers to gather all this information. What Hope is doing in Hinsey Hall is showing us just how much we now know about this species. But primarily, the name comes from the desire that we have, the hope that we have for the future. The human species decided in the 1966 to stop hunting blue whales because we realized that we'd taken the largest animal that's ever lived on the planet that we know of right to the edge of extinction, and we were about to lose it. So all of the nations that were whaling got together and said, we have to stop. And we stopped. And in those years since, the 50 years or so, numbers of blue whales have started to increase again. That was because of international cooperation, collaboration, and it shows that when you work together, you can make a change, and you don't have to be working in government. You can be doing it from your own home. You can be thinking about the things that you're buying, the things that you're throwing away, how you're, responsibly using your environment. All those things make a difference. So the name Hope, it just drops so easily into a sentence in conversation. It's about hope for the future. That's really what it's about.
Absolutely, and there is hope for the future, definitely.
Most definitely.
That is a fantastic thought to end on, Richard, to wrap our talk up today. It's been brilliant speaking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your research and all of these fantastic stories from our collection. It's been absolutely fascinating, and hopefully we can have you back on again soon because there's plenty more to talk about. But
and I'll bring another carrot.
Bring another carrot, definitely. We'll say goodbye to you for now. Hope to see you soon, Richard. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
And thank you to you, our viewers, for your fantastic questions. I hope you enjoyed that talk as much as I did. Do join us again. We are back on Friday morning, but with a bit of a difference. We've got for our family festival a fun, family-friendly quiz for you all to take part in. So do join us then. But of course, we're here every Tuesday at 12 and every Friday at 10:30. With more Nature Live. So do join us, see us again. But for now, we'll say goodbye. Hope to see you soon. Take care.